In 1975, a cardiologist from Tokyo traveled to a remote village in Okinawa to investigate reports of unusual longevity among its residents. What he found there would anchor 5 decades of research into why certain populations age so differently from the rest of the industrialized world. The residents he documented were not simply living longer. They were maintaining physical function, cognitive clarity, and cardiovascular health at ages that had no precedent in the clinical literature he had trained on. What made this population scientifically interesting was not their genetics. Okinawans who emigrated to Hawaii and adopted Western dietary patterns lost their longevity advantage within a generation. The biological outcomes followed the behavior, not the ancestry. That single observation carries more practical weight than most longevity research produced since, because it means the mechanisms responsible for exceptional aging are accessible, not inherited. This video is about those mechanisms, specifically about a cellular process that the Okinawan dietary pattern appears to have been activating for generations without any awareness of the underlying biology, and that a Japanese cell biologist confirmed at the molecular level decades later, earning a Nobel Prize in the process. Before we get into the science, one question worth asking yourself: what does your current eating pattern look like in the hours after dinner? Do you snack late, eat close to sleep, or wake up and eat immediately? Drop your answer in the comments. It is directly relevant to everything covered here, and I read every one. Here's the biology first. Every cell in your body contains a quality control and recycling system that operates continuously in the background. This system, autophagy, from the Greek for self-eating, identifies damaged proteins, dysfunctional organelles, and cellular debris, breaks them down, and recycles the components into usable building material. Think of it the way a city's maintenance department operates during off-peak hours. The roads are still there, the infrastructure still exists, but the repair crews can only do their work efficiently when traffic is low enough to access the damaged sections. Autophagy is that maintenance department. And like a maintenance crew that cannot work during rush hour, it cannot operate effectively when the cell is in a high-nutrient, high-insulin state, which is exactly the state produced by frequent eating and large meals. The Nobel Prize awarded in 2016 to Yoshinori Ohsumi for his work on autophagy confirmed what had been hypothesized for decades, that cellular self-renewal is not a passive process that happens at a fixed rate regardless of conditions. It is a regulated process that activates most intensively under specific metabolic conditions, primarily during extended periods of low nutrient availability. The molecular details Ohsumi established in yeast cells have since been replicated in human tissue across hundreds of subsequent studies. The Okinawan centenarians were triggering this process through 2 behavioral patterns that have now been studied extensively. The first is caloric moderation through a practice called Hara hachi, stopping at approximately 80% satiety rather than eating to fullness. The second is an extended overnight fast, finishing the last meal in the early evening and not eating again until late morning. Together, these behaviors create the metabolic conditions that allow autophagy to operate during its most productive window, the final hours before waking after 12 to 16 hours of fasting. The mechanism behind Hara hachi is more specific than simply eating less. When a meal is large enough to fully occupy digestive capacity and produce a substantial insulin response, the cell receives a clear signal that nutrients are abundant and cellular maintenance can wait. Insulin is the primary suppressor of autophagy, not because it is harmful in itself, but because its presence signals a nutrient-rich state in which the cell prioritizes processing incoming material over recycling existing components. A smaller meal produces a more modest insulin response, a shorter saturation period, and an earlier return to the metabolic state that allows cellular repair to resume. The centenarians Suzuki documented in Okinawa were not consciously managing their insulin or thinking about autophagy. They were following a cultural norm around portion size that happened to align precisely with what the cellular biology requires. That alignment between cultural practice and molecular mechanism is what makes the Okinawan data so scientifically compelling. The gut health dimension of this picture was contributed by a gastroenterologist who spent decades examining colons across a wide range of dietary patterns and identified a consistent correlation between extended digestive rest and superior intestinal tissue health. After examining over 300,000 patients over 30 years, the pattern was unambiguous. Those who gave their digestive systems 14 to 16 hours of rest overnight showed measurably healthier intestinal lining, more robust gut barrier function, and lower markers of systemic inflammation compared to those who ate late, snacked frequently, or reduced their fasting window to fewer than 10 hours. The intestinal lining replaces itself every 3 to 5 days, one of the fastest cellular turnover rates in the body. That renewal process requires the lining cells to shift from active digestive function to repair and replication mode. When the digestive system is continuously processing food, that shift is delayed. When the fasting window is extended to 14 hours or more, the lining cells have uninterrupted time to complete their renewal cycle, which translates to a more intact gut barrier and reduced translocation of inflammatory compounds into systemic circulation. A compromised gut barrier, sometimes called increased intestinal permeability, has been associated in research with elevated systemic inflammation, which is a contributing factor to cardiovascular disease, metabolic dysfunction, and neurodegenerative conditions. Repairing and maintaining gut barrier integrity through extended fasting windows is not a peripheral benefit. It is a central mechanism through which the Okinawan dietary pattern appears to reduce risk across multiple disease categories simultaneously. The timing of the fasting window matters in ways that most people do not fully account for. Autophagy does not activate uniformly throughout a fast. Research tracking autophagic markers over the course of an extended fast shows that the process accelerates non-linearly. The first 8 to 10 hours produce modest activation, and the window from 12 to 16 hours represents the period of most intensive autophagic activity in most tissues. This is why the Okinawan pattern of finishing dinner by early evening and not eating until late morning the following day, creating a 14 to 16-hour window, produces qualitatively different outcomes than a 10-hour fast that begins and ends at different times. The circadian dimension adds another layer. Cellular repair processes, including autophagy, are partially regulated by the circadian clock. They are more active during the biological nighttime. Eating late in the evening disrupts this alignment by sending a nutrient availability signal to cells that are biologically primed for repair rather than processing. The practical implication: the same 14-hour fast produces different autophagic outcomes depending on when it occurs relative to the light-dark cycle. A fast from 7 p.m. to 9 a.m. aligns with circadian biology in a way that a fast from midnight to 2 p.m. does not. The Okinawan centenarians ate their last meal in the early evening and their first meal late in the morning, an eating pattern that modern chronobiology now recognizes as circadian-aligned, time-restricted eating. They arrived at this pattern through cultural convention, not scientific design. The mechanism they were exploiting was not understood until decades after the behavioral pattern was documented. Now, the food composition itself, because the what of eating is as important as the when. The Okinawan dietary pattern that Suzuki documented in the centenarians differed substantially from the rest of Japan's diet during the same period. The primary carbohydrate was purple sweet potato rather than white rice. The distinction matters biologically. Purple sweet potato has a lower glycemic index than white rice, producing a more gradual and modest insulin response. This matters for autophagy because sustained insulin elevation, even at non-diabetic levels, is sufficient to suppress autophagic activity. A diet centered on low glycemic carbohydrates maintains the insulin environment that allows cellular repair to continue operating between meals, not just during fasting windows. Beyond the glycemic index, purple sweet potato contains anthocyanins, the pigments responsible for its color, which are a class of polyphenol with documented effects on oxidative stress and inflammation. Research has shown that anthocyanins reduce the oxidative damage to cellular components that autophagy is designed to clear. Less ongoing oxidative damage means less accumulated debris requiring autophagic processing, which means the system can operate more efficiently rather than perpetually catching up. Bitter melon, another staple in the traditional Okinawan diet, contains compounds including charantin and memorticin that influence glucose uptake and insulin sensitivity. The practical effect is a lower average blood glucose and insulin environment over the course of a day, which prolongs the metabolic windows in which autophagy can operate. Bitter melon is not a food that appears frequently in Western dietary discussions, but its presence in the centenarian diet is not incidental. Seaweed provides iodine, fucoidan, and a spectrum of minerals that support thyroid function, detoxification pathways, and cellular membrane integrity. Fucoidan specifically has been studied for its effects on cellular cleanup pathways, and while the human data is still developing, the mechanism is consistent with the broader pattern of the Okinawan diet, supporting autophagic function through multiple converging pathways rather than a single active compound. Tofu provides complete protein at a lower caloric density than animal protein, with an amino acid profile that supports muscle maintenance without the saturated fat and heme iron load associated with red meat consumption. In older adults specifically, maintaining adequate protein intake while keeping total caloric intake moderate, which is what the Hara hachi principle achieves, is one of the central nutritional challenges of healthy aging. The Okinawan centenarians resolved it through a diet that is protein adequate but not protein heavy, sourced primarily from soy, fish, and legumes. The beverage pattern was equally consistent. Green tea and jasmine tea consumed throughout the day provided polyphenols, particularly EGCG in green tea, that have been shown in cell studies and animal models to directly support autophagic pathways. The polyphenols in green tea activate AMPK, an enzyme that functions as a cellular energy sensor and one of the primary molecular triggers for autophagy. When AMPK is active, cells shift from growth and storage mode into maintenance and repair mode. This is the same shift triggered by fasting, by exercise, and by caloric restriction. Green tea polyphenols appear to partially replicate the molecular signal through a different upstream mechanism. The morning meal pattern is worth examining specifically. Rather than beginning the day with a large meal immediately after waking, which truncates the fasting window and rapidly suppresses autophagy, the pattern involved a gradual transition from the fasted state. A small amount of vegetable juice or broth, followed by a waiting period before any solid food, allowed the body to extend the autophagic window while gently restoring fluid and mineral balance. A tablespoon of olive oil in the morning, a practice documented in centenarian populations across multiple longevity zones, provides monounsaturated fat that slows gastric emptying and blunts the insulin response to subsequent carbohydrate intake, without itself triggering the insulin spike that suppresses autophagy. This is a good moment to pause. If this level of mechanistic detail, the biology behind the behavior rather than just the recommendation, is what you are looking for in health content, subscribe. This channel is specifically built for people who want to understand the science well enough to make decisions that are genuinely informed rather than based on trend. The critical finding from the longitudinal data collected over decades of Okinawan research is the dose-response relationship between behavioral consistency and outcome. The centenarians were not perfect practitioners of any single principle. They were consistent practitioners of a cluster of interconnected habits: moderate portions, early last meals, whole food composition, extended overnight fasts, daily movement with no sedentary extreme, and strong social connection that together created an internal environment in which cellular repair systems could do their work. The decline in Okinawan longevity outcomes among younger generations who adopted Western dietary patterns demonstrates the reversibility of that environment in both directions. Adopting fast food, late eating, constant snacking, and high glycemic carbohydrates disrupted the metabolic conditions that the ancestral population had maintained instinctively. The biological outcomes followed predictably. The practical protocol that emerges from 5 decades of Okinawan research and the molecular biology that explains it is not complicated. It does not require calorie counting, expensive supplementation, or pharmaceutical intervention. It requires stopping eating when approximately 80% full at each meal, not based on measuring, but on learning to recognize the transition point between comfortable satiety and fullness. This is a skill that develops with attention over several weeks. Finishing the last meal of the day between 6 and 7 in the evening, or at minimum 3 to 4 hours before sleep, to allow the digestive system to begin its rest cycle before the biological nighttime begins. Extending the morning fast to at least 12 hours, working toward 14 to 16 hours as the body adapts. Beginning the morning with warm water, herbal tea, or a small amount of vegetable juice rather than an immediate solid meal. Centering the diet around low glycemic whole foods, vegetables in a range of colors, legumes, fish, small amounts of fermented soy, and limited refined carbohydrate, to maintain the insulin environment that allows autophagy to operate between meals as well as during fasting windows. Incorporating green tea as a daily practice, not as a supplement, but as a consistent behavioral anchor that provides EGCG throughout the day. The expected timeline for observable change from these behavioral shifts is consistent with what the research documents. The first 1 to 2 weeks typically produce improvements in energy stability and sleep quality as circadian alignment improves and blood glucose variability decreases. Weeks 2 to 4 bring cognitive clarity improvements and reduction in the afternoon energy drop that most people attribute to normal aging, but is frequently a consequence of postprandial insulin dynamics. Beyond 6 weeks, the cumulative effects of sustained autophagic activity become more apparent. Markers of inflammation decrease, immune function improves, and the general sense of physical function that people describe as feeling younger is, at the cellular level, the result of a more effective repair cycle operating on a more consistent schedule. What Okinawan centenarian research ultimately demonstrates is that the biology of aging is more plastic than the standard medical framing suggests. The rate at which cellular damage accumulates is not fixed. It is influenced, substantially, by the metabolic environment that behavior creates. Autophagy is not a luxury function that activates only in extreme conditions. It is a baseline maintenance process that your cells are designed to perform regularly and that modern eating patterns systematically suppress. The centenarians were not special. They were consistent in their portions, their timing, their food choices, and their daily rhythm. That consistency created an internal environment in which cellular maintenance could proceed without chronic interruption. The biology did the rest. Yoshinori Osumi's Nobel Prize research did not reveal something new about human potential. It provided the molecular explanation for something the longest-lived people on Earth had been demonstrating behaviorally for generations. The capacity for cellular renewal is present in every human body. What determines whether it operates effectively is the conditions that behavior either creates or prevents. That is the Okinawan lesson. Not a protocol to follow mechanically, but a set of principles to understand clearly enough that the behavior becomes self-reinforcing. When you understand why the eating window matters, the early last meal is not a sacrifice. When you understand what Hara is doing at the cellular level, stopping at 80% becomes something other than restraint. It becomes a choice made with full knowledge of what it activates. The research is in the description. The principles are straightforward. The biology responds when the conditions are right.